Good.
Well, I can promise that I won't stretch your patience and it won't be long. Professor Wolfson and myself will share a podium coming Saturday in Dresden. I'll be the first, you'll be the second then. Professor Porat, ladies and gentlemen, well, I don't know how much time do I have. It reminds me, mentioned that I worked with President Herzog, and at one point we visit, I think it was Kibbutz Genosar, it was just about this hour, and President Herzog stood up, took the podium and said to the audience, the kibbutzniks, Kibbutznik members, how much time do I have? So one of the kibbutzniks stood up and said, Mr. President, you can speak as much as you want. We go home at 8 o'clock. So, well, before I start my brief presentation, I need to indicate that it is based upon many sources and resources, documentation, etc., but basically most of all on my own experience as ambassador to Germany between these 2007 and 2011, and they include meeting with German Chancellor, the three latest German Foreign Minister, Joschka Fischer, Frank Steinmeier and Guido Westerwelle, many members of the political parties of German parliament, media, people, and more, including Professor Wolfson. And what I have to say that I'm now a free agent. I left the Foreign Service, so all I say is my personal observation, and I am responsible, and only me, responsible for the things that you're going to hear briefly this evening. Spatial relationship between Israel and Germany. A day after I was nominated ambassador to Germany, it was published, I got a telephone call from then a visiting dignitary from Germany. Joschka Fischer was then AD. He has concluded his term of duty a bit earlier. Asked me to meet, and I gladly we had breakfast at the King David Terrace in Jerusalem. And then he asked me, said something which was, in a way, eye-opener, and I'll stretch it a bit later during my presentation. He asked me, Mr. Ambassador, you are the 8th ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to Germany, to Berlin, but you're first Israeli born, I mean not born, but 7th generation Israeli. I didn't come from that discipline. My family didn't suffer the Holocaust. In fact, my expertise was America and the peace process, as you heard. And he said, Mr. Ambassador, is it a signal that the Israeli government is sending to the German government and the German parliament, the German public, that now we are slowly moving into normalization of the relationship? Is it a signal? I have to say that at that particular point of time, I didn't know how to answer him, and I did it later on in many occasions in which I met Joschka Fischer. He became a very close friend. I arrived to Berlin on Thursday, November 15, 2007. The next day I was invited to meet unofficially the Chancellor, the Bundeskanzlerin. That is before presenting my credentials to the German President a month later. This is unprecedented, and it's not only me. This, I would say, a president that goes with all Israeli ambassador. Rov HaShagirim, most of the foreign ambassador, all of the foreign ambassadors except of the Israelis, sometimes do not see the Bundeskanzlerin in private during the 4 or 5 years of their stay in Berlin, and here it is. I hardly unpacked my suitcases, was invited to discuss with the Bundeschancellor. It was a very cordial meeting in which the Bundeschancellor mentioned a number of times the unique and spatial relationship between our two countries. יחסים מיוחדים וייחודיים בעברית ובגרמנית besondere und einzigartige Beziehungen. She mentioned it time and again, time and again. This is, in essence, was the nature of my relative long conversation with President Köhler when I presented him my credential, repeating his statement to the Knesset 2 years earlier, using time and again the coin spatial relations. The paired words spatial relations need to be analyzed. Let's try to understand the nature and the ethos on which they are based upon, if they exist. It is commonly agreed among all or almost all observers of German-Israeli politics that the first pillar on which they are based upon is the historical perspective in which the Holocaust is a major factor. In other words, New Germany, sogenannte andere Deutschland, has adopted a meta-narrative of direct and unshared responsibility for the past. This self-definition implies, first and foremost, an uncompromising commitment to the two narratives. What are the two narratives? The first one, peace politics. The second one, Holocaust narrative. The commitment to peace politics manifested itself in unshakable German commitment to international law, multilateralism, and the reluctance to use the force. Some of my colleagues, when I was ambassador there, some of my foreign ambassador colleagues would call Germany when evidently there was an international crisis, when force was used, Germany is the gentle giant. Germany doesn't want to use force. Germany is interested to use international law. Germany wants to introduce back the Wilsonian principles of negotiations. Do not use force. The Holocaust narrative implies an unwavering pledge to uphold human rights, pluralism, and spatial relationship with the Jewish people and Israel. Luckily, Professor Porat, I don't have to comment on the absence of representative of the Jewish community here, but I suppose my view of it wouldn't be different from those that were expressed by my friend Michael Wolfson. I will come back to this question, how far the two pillars come to full expression in the last 8 years, almost 8 years, of the Merkel administration. But first, let us examine if this uncompromising commitment to Israel was always a compelling pillar of German foreign policy. Is the claim that the spatial historical responsibility is part of the very raison of state, raison d'etat of Germany, have been the case for every German government? And if so, can one predict that this will remain so for the foreseeable future? Let's examine this claim, and let's have a look of the historical and whether it carries historical accuracy, and whether the conclusion of the brilliant Haaretz foreign affairs editor Adar Primor, and I quote now, who said a few years ago in an article in Haaretz, I quote now, "German leaders can come and go, as can the generation, but policy towards Israel and the Jews will remain the same," end of citat. Is it equally precise? This is a good question to start with. I don't know that I, and for that matter anybody, can predict what will be the political genome of future generation of German leaders and decision makers. They may abide by the spirit of commitment, they may not. But clearly, we have to say, it was not always so. Namely, the so-called special relationship were evidently not the case from day one. They have gradually developed through the years. Let us have a review of the development of the German-Israeli ties. The 1952 Luxembourg Reparations Agreement, which is now marked as German rectitude, were then 60 years ago, in my view, a pragmatic step taken by Chancellor Adenauer to bring Germany as close to the USA and Europe. We have to remember that the agreement was then ratified by only a small majority in the Bundestag. It was not commonly accepted wall to wall in the German public and not in the German public as represented in the Bundestag. That was not part of what in the future will be known as uncompromising and unchangeable commitment to the security of the State of Israel. A decade later, Chancellor Ludwig Erhard's foreign minister, Gerhard Schröder, this is not the Gerhard Schröder we all know, this is a different Gerhard Schröder from the 50s, objected to the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel on the ground that it may affect the ties of Germany with the Arab world. Willy Brandt, Chancellor Brandt, announced policy of even-handedness, neutrality between Israel and the Arab world. And Helmut Schmidt labeled Prime Minister Begin a danger to world peace. And after having approved an arms deal to sell Leopard Mark II tanks to Saudi Arabia, said the German foreign policy would not be held hostage any longer by Auschwitz. In the early 80s, at the administration of Helmut Kohl, you mentioned it, Michael, Schmidt's successor, the relations were at a very low point, and a change came only during a speech in Bergen-Belsen in 1985 by Helmut Kohl, in which he said, demonstrative normality was now out, expression of profound concern were the order of the day. On top of it, we have to remember that that was representing only part, as again Michael said, of divided Germany. Is Germany was and remained hostile to Israel and vastly anti-Semitic, covered by anti-Zionism. I suggest that you find some time to look on your writing of Michael and also of Professor Angela Thiem, who wrote it at real time. Here it is a good place to mention the fierce exchange of letters between Shamir and Chancellor Kohl over the prospective unification of Germany. Then, Prime Minister Shamir wrote to Kohl that the Jewish people and Israel feel threatened from the might that united Germany will possess. We all remember The Speaker of the House at that time, the late Dov Shilansky, dressed in mourning according to Jewish tradition as the mourners of Zion. At the end of the letters exchange, Chancellor Kohl expressed the commitment of Germany to Israel, and a new page episode that I happened to hear from President Bush, the father, on the occasion that he came to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the unification of Germany. He said it also publicly, that he understood the concern of Prime Minister Shamir at that particular time. In fact, he said that Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, and even Mitterrand were much more hostile to the unification of Germany, quoting Mitterrand as saying, "I love Germany so much, I want to have two of them." Quote, unquote. In February 2005, German President Horst Köhler addressed the Knesset and underlined that Israel should live in internationally recognized boundaries, free of fear and terror, is incontrovertible maxim of German policy. Quote, "My country has proven this time and again through its action. Germany will always stand by Israel and its people." We start to see a vocal expression of change. On the same day, Prime Minister Sharon responded, emphasizing the two symbolic dates will forever characterize the relations between the two countries, namely the liberation of Auschwitz camp and the establishment of bilateral relations. Yet the PM also underscored the positive development of the spatial relationship, indicating that Germany has reiterated time and again its commitment to the security and welfare of Israel and has backed up this commitment with action in critical hours as in regular days. Germany rose to Israel's assistance in the attempts to solve the painful humanitarian problem of our missing soldiers. Cut. It is not regular that a government entrusts into hands of another government the issue, a sensitive issue, like the issue that we were dealing, the freeing or the discovering or the information of missing Israeli soldiers, because it involves in open up intelligence files, and we did it with Germany, and we were never disappointed by the very active and strong commitment demonstrated by the German interlocutor on those talks. Just about 3 years later, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, in an address in the Knesset, repeated the essence of this message, declaring that Israel's right to exist is raison d'etat and unquestionable and shared by all Germans, and it is a commitment that is rock solid. But she added something else concerning the political process, to be more precise, the German concept or the German view of the Middle East conflict, which I will discuss a bit later. Some observers here in Israel, some in Germany, have doubted that the sincerity of one German chancellor or another concerning his sympathy for Israel. Just an example, comparing Chancellor Schröder's commitment to Israel to Angela Merkel. I'm not sure, and I'm sorry that Andres, the ambassador, had to leave because he worked very closely with Chancellor Schröder. I'm not sure that this is an accurate and effective manner in which the relation should be analyzed. In my view, Israel traditionally enjoyed cross-party support in Germany. We have mentioned East Germany, we have mentioned the Stasi, also we should mention the Linke. During my tenure in Germany, there was not even one single party or one single political persona that I decided to boycott. Among my best friends was Gysi, a very important figure in the Linke party. By the way, that at lunch at home, he once told me that he was a very young man in the 1967 war, the Six-Day War. He was in East Germany. His father was a politruk. His father was a politician, German politician. And the father came back home, and he told Gysi, the young Gysi, that now I know there is official anti-Semitism in East Germany. And when Gysi asked him, how do you count it? He said, because they have the complete file, as you said, Michael, the complete files of all names of German Jewish leaders, East and West, followed. And he said, from then, I understood where I live. But when you look at the anniversary of the State of Israel, the 60th anniversary of Israel, I suggest to read Gysi address speech at the Bundestag, which is different from the CDU, different from Merkel, different from Steinmeier, but still adhering to the basic, profound commitment of Germany to the Jewish people, and in particular to the State of Israel, with long and strong reservations. It is well worth to mention that maybe only like the USA, the German position on the relations with Israel can be viewed as almost a domestic German consideration and not only a foreign policy decision or matter. This is very typical to the beltway, to the machinery that works in Washington. In a way, as ambassador, I discover time and again, that domestic political considerations are strongly tied to the overview of the nature of the relations between Germany and Israel, and I said it to the credit and not as a criticizing point. As we're coming closer to the German general elections, which will take place coming September, I'm quite often asked if a possible change of government might affect the basic core of the relations between the two countries. My answer is qualified yes and no. No, because I believe that the pillar of the relations are based upon very deep beliefs. Yes, sometimes there is a field, I hope not many of them, of different nuances of views concerning regional politics in which Israel is a major partner. But I say also no. I have observed Joschka Fischer, Steinmeier and Westerwelle conducts concerning Israel, and in my view the differences are only a question of nuances and not really of substance. All the three important foreign ministers in one way or another reiterated that Germany unconditionally supports Israel's right of existence and that Israel's security is a cornerstone of German foreign policy. It is interesting to listen or to read what Yoshka has written in 2005. Again, I'm sorry that Andres is not here. I heard it time and again from Yoshka before I make the citat here. He said that in May 2002, Joschka Fischer, as a German foreign minister, visited Israel and stayed at the Dan Panorama alongside the beach. And I think it was 11 o'clock, he said 11 o'clock at night, he heard a huge blast. He ran away with sandals, crossed the street to the Dolphinarium, in which tens of Israeli youth were butchered. And then Yoshka, Andres was with him. And Yoshka said, I was standing in blood to my ankles. I smelled the blood. Then it was the first time I understand the dilemma, the existential dilemma of the state of Israel. Next day, he went to Ramallah to see Arafat, and it was the first time that Arafat heard clear statement coming from Berlin by Joschka Fischer. Now, let's see what he wrote 2005, almost 3 years later. The first contacts with the state of Israel also helped set a key course in the foreign policy of the young Federal Republic, a course that we still follow today and we will always follow in the future. Germany unconditionally supports Israel's right of existence. We are all committed to the right of, listen, to the right of the citizen of Israel to live within secure borders and in peace with their neighbors, free, again, free from fear of terror or violence. This commitment to Israel is not attached to any reservations or condition, is not negotiable, and is the foundation on which the spatial relationship between our two countries is built. It is cornerstone of German foreign policy and will remain so. As former ambassador to Germany, I can attest to it. I can actually bring many more on-the-record statements by leading German decision makers, but I will suffice myself with one more, this time from Bundeskanzlerin Angela Merkel, echoing similar sentiments about Israel. For us, I quote, relations with Israel are a precious treasure that we must preserve. We and the coming generation must therefore be aware of our history and the responsibility it entails. We must take a clear and public stand about maintaining close relations with the Jewish community in Germany and, of course, close relations with Israel. Well, this is a good opening to discuss briefly. As I promised, I won't be too long. The almost 8 years of Merkel administration relations and Israel. I have to say that I feel, as my predecessor and I hope as my successor, feel privileged to have been able to maintain almost personal contact with the Bundeskanzlerin and the foreign ministers. Not only that she is totally committed to the spirit and to the understanding of the existence of Israel, she's totally committed to the Jewish community, as you may know. One of her best friends is one that Andreas mentioned here, Charlotte Knobloch, the former head of the Jewish community in Germany. Very, very close friends. And I can say that in all of the dealings that I had, and I'm sure that my predecessors as well, with the office of the Chancellor, were always very open, very frank, and very useful. Since I came from, so to speak, American culture, I felt that this is a sort of maybe copying, duplicating the essence of the relations that Israel has with completely different various American administration. In fact, if I may go back to the first meeting that we had on that Friday, the 16th, November 16th, Mrs. Merkel asked me, so ambassador, I was not even then entitled to carry the title ambassador, as I did not even present my credential. She said, what do you expect of the relations? What do you expect my office? And I say, if I may, Bundeskanzlerin, to imitate and to export from the relations that we have with the USA to somewhat to what we have with Germany. They're always in the meetings. We always were the relations with America, sometimes with, as we all read, disagreement, were frankly put on the table. Secondly, I say that if we have disagreement and we have various opinions about different aspects of the political development in the Middle East or international-wise, let's do it directly. Let's do it on the level of one-to-one, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Bundeskanzler Merkel. By the way, they've used to speak at least once a week, if not more than. Fortunately, this is not the case now. But it used to be. At least once or twice a week, Ehud Olmert, the Prime Minister, spoke with Merkel. And I can say that clearly there were all of the sensitive issues brought to life in the telephone conversation or in the meeting. The first meeting that took place after my arrival between the Chancellor and Olmert took place on February, I think, 2nd or 3rd, the next year, 2008, and 6 weeks after my arrival to Berlin. And after the ceremony, Chancellor Merkel took the Prime Minister and 3 of us or 4 of us with 3 or 4 of her very close aide to a place where we spent almost all night discussing the various issues. And since Ehud Olmert has freely disclosed it, then I may follow suit. Ehud Olmert shared with the Chancellor not only the dilemma on the issue of the ongoing attacks from Gaza to Sderot and to Israel, but also the dilemma with Syrian rearming itself. Later on, according to foreign media, Israel has even put an end to the development of a nuclear plant in Syria. There, everything was on the table. And it was not surprise that a few months later, when we had to go into Gaza, Merkel recruited Prime Minister Brown of England, of Great Britain, Sarkozy from France, and Berlusconi from Italy, and Tony Blair from the EU, and brought them in an act of solidarity to take a photo which has a lot of meaning in international relations, in the diplomatic language, standing by Israel. Germany was standing behind us. And again, in the next operation in Gaza. And again, when we were involved in other activities. I can even share with you, and I maybe prefer that that would be kept here, and not, oh, it is there. Forget it. Forget it. So in sensitive issues, the relations and the contacts between Israeli decision makers and German decision makers were totally and absolutely frank sometimes, more than I even evidently saw in the relations with America. Is it to say, again, that the relations between the two countries are ironclad, that nothing can damage them, that nothing can harm them? No, I'm not saying that. Nothing is selbstverständlich, nothing is for granted. Relations are based on the attitude and behavior on all sides, in our case, on both sides, and in particular case, on three sides: Israel, Berlin, and the Palestinians. I have to say that more than once I heard from either observers of the relations or decision makers or members of the Bundestag that Israel's acts and political behavior toward the Palestinians bring to a collision between two beliefs in Germany. The one that it is Germany is fully, totally, unconditionally committed to Israel, but also to international law. And I've recommended time and again to various Israeli foreign ministers, prime ministers, listen to the voices coming from Berlin. Nothing is forever. Relations, diplomatic relations, political relations, trade relations develops as all sides want them to develop. And again, be aware of the fact that sometimes foreign policies can come on course of collision, and unfortunately in the last 10 or 11 or 12 months, or a little even more, from the time I was, in fact, almost 2 years, the relations got some, in the very sweet taste of the relations, there was some bitterness. And the bitterness can be attributed, in my view, to one and only one issue. It is the issue of the political process with the Palestinian, namely, the illegal, in German and international and also American view, the illegal continuation of settlement buildings in the West Bank, and the view that comes from the EU, Washington and Berlin, that those settlements, not they are only illegal, they constitute an obstacle to peace. And when Chancellor Merkel, in one of the statements in the Bundestag, made a statement, in a minute, statement talking about the need to the two-state solution view, there was criticism in Israel. And the answer from the office of the Chancellor was there, this is our commitment to Jewish state. This is all about, the two-state solution is all about one state which is Jewish, and this is the only leader in Europe that made a precondition on the Palestinians that any agreement should recognize Israel as the Jewish state. So I hear that we need to come too close to it. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, Dina. In the course of 4 years of stay in Berlin, more than once I recall the briefing that we had here with you just before leaving. And I again would say here, strong and loud, that I completely trust the pillar of the relations between Berlin and Jerusalem, with all the attributes, cultural and politics and trade, etc. But I also, in parentheses, would say that one in Jerusalem, in the office of the Prime Minister and the office of the Foreign Ministry, should be aware that basically international relations and diplomatic relations are based on interest. Thank you.